Is that really your grandfather? The teenager sneered, his eyes scanning the elderly man sitting quietly on the park bench. Chloe, standing nearby, felt the heat rise in her cheeks. She had warned him, told him her grandfather wasn't the one to mock. But here they were, surrounded by a group of teens who didn't know any better. Grandpa Jack was always the quiet one, the type to keep to himself, but Chloe knew better. She knew the story behind his calm demeanor, the battles he had fought, and the history that ran deep in the veins of the man they all laughed at. But here, in the park, with the sun hanging low and the world moving faster than it should, they couldn't see it. Come on, Grandpa, you still think you're some kind of hero? One of the teens, Ethan, said with a mocking grin. What's your rank, old man? What? You still got your old SEAL badge. His friend snickered, the sound grating on Chloe's nerves. Grandpa Jack didn't flinch. His weathered hands rested on his lap, his blue eyes fixed on something far away, but there was no response, no sign of anger. He'd been through worse, much worse. I don't need to prove anything to you. He finally spoke, his voice steady. I served. I did my part. That's all that matters. But the teens weren't having it. Yeah, right, Ethan scoffed. Show me your medal, Grandpa. But it's just some cheap knockoff you got from a souvenir shop. The rest of the group laughed, but Chloe felt the sting of their words deep in her chest. Grandpa Jack's gaze remained fixed ahead, but Chloe saw it, the slight tremor in his hand, the way he held himself so still. He wasn't bothered by their mockery. It wasn't the first time he'd been underestimated. But Chloe knew the truth. She knew the man sitting beside her was a legend. You think I'm just an old man? Grandpa Jack's voice rose just a fraction, more to himself than to the teens. You think you know what it means to serve? Ethan looked him up and down, then pointed at the worn patch on Grandpa Jack's sleeve, the one that had faded over the years. What's that supposed to be? He laughed, tapping at the patch with his finger. A souvenir from your little war games. But the moment his finger brushed the patch, the world around them seemed to shift. The chatter of the teens faded, replaced by the memories flooding Grandpa Jack's mind. The park bench vanished, replaced by the smell of salt air and gunpowder. He was no longer sitting in the park, but crouched low in the sand of a beach, waves crashing, the sound of helicopters in the distance. His younger self, sharp-eyed and ready for whatever came next, a different man entirely. The patch on his arm wasn't just cloth. It was the symbol of the SEALs, a badge of honor, earned through sacrifice. And just as quickly, the vision was gone. Grandpa Jack looked down at his worn hands, then back at the teens, his face as calm as ever. I'm not here to impress you, he said, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Ethan, still standing, didn't know how to react. His cocky grin faded. Chloe could see it in his eyes now. He had no idea who he was dealing with. But before the teens could speak again, something shifted in the air, like the calm before a storm. The hum of distant motors, the screech of tires. A convoy of black SUVs appeared, roaring down the street with purpose. The teens paused, looking confused as the vehicles screeched to a halt nearby. The doors swung open, and figures clad in military uniforms stepped out, their presence commanding the air around them. Chloe's heart skipped a beat. She knew what this meant. A man stepped forward, tall, his uniform crisp, the 4 stars on his shoulder gleaming in the fading light. General Thompson, the crowd whispered. He looked directly at Grandpa Jack, his eyes locking onto him as if he could see straight through the years. Without a word, the general walked toward them, his boots echoing on the pavement, a silent command to all who watched. The teens, standing still in disbelief, didn't know what to do. Grandpa Jack's calm remained, but his eyes, now meeting the general's, told a different story. The general stopped in front of him, his face softening for the first time. Jack, he said, his voice steady but filled with reverence. It's been a long time. I owe you more than I can ever repay. Chloe watched in awe as the general, without hesitation, snapped to attention and saluted Grandpa Jack. The teens, still frozen, had no words. The general turned to them, his expression hardening. This man, who you mock, is a living legend, he said, his voice booming across the silence. He fought battles you'll never understand. Show some respect. The air seemed to hang heavy as the reality of the moment hit the teens. The jokes had stopped, the laughter gone. They stood, mouths agape, as Grandpa Jack, his true identity revealed, stood tall, his shoulders straight, his past finally recognized. It was the moment they would never forget. The silence in the air was thick, like a blanket smothering the park. The general's salute still echoed in Chloe's mind, the weight of the moment settling around them. Grandpa Jack stood there, unmoving, as if the world around him had finally caught up. The teens were frozen, their arrogance now stripped away, replaced by an uncomfortable silence that spread like wildfire. Ethan, the leader of the group, stood at the front, his mouth slightly agape, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The general, still standing at attention, slowly lowered his hand, his eyes never leaving Grandpa Jack. "You don't know who he is, do you?" The general's voice was calm but firm, echoing through the still air. "This man right here, Jack Carter, he's a legend. A SEAL legend." The words hit the teens like a ton of bricks. Ethan, who had mocked Grandpa Jack just moments ago, stood motionless, his mind racing to catch up. "He served in places you couldn't even dream of," the general continued, his voice rising slightly in pride. "Places where no one could survive, except those who truly understood what it meant to protect this country. And Jack, he was one of the finest." Chloe stood by, feeling a rush of pride she hadn't expected. She had always known, but hearing the general speak like this, it was different. The honor, the respect, it filled her heart. Grandpa Jack, her quiet, humble grandfather, was finally being seen for who he truly was. She glanced at the group of teens. The laughter, the mocking, it was gone. They were no longer the loudest voices in the room. Now, their eyes were wide, glued to the man they had underestimated. The general turned his gaze back to them, his voice now commanding. "You should all be ashamed of yourselves. This man's sacrifices built the foundation of this country. And you, with your arrogance, couldn't even begin to understand what that means." Ethan's face turned red, his shoulders stiff, as the weight of the general's words crushed him. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Grandpa Jack, who had remained silent throughout, finally spoke, his voice steady as always. "I didn't need to prove anything to you," he said, his words simple yet powerful. "I'm not looking for your respect. I never was. I did what I did because it was the right thing to do, and I didn't do it for recognition." The general nodded, clearly approving of Grandpa Jack's calm demeanor. "That's the heart of a true hero," he said, turning back to the teens. "And it's something you will never understand, not until you've walked the path that he has." Chloe felt a weight lift off her shoulders. The tension in the air, the unease from the group of teens, was palpable. The general's words had dismantled the arrogance that had once filled the space between them. "You're dismissed," the general said, turning to leave. "But remember this day. You've just met a true hero, and I hope you never forget it." The teens stood there, stunned, as the general and Grandpa Jack walked away, side by side. The quiet, the respect, the weight of it all hung in the air long after they had gone. And for the first time that day, Chloe felt proud, proud of her grandfather, proud of who he was, and proud of the man who had finally been given the recognition he deserved. The day seemed to stretch on forever as Grandpa Jack and Chloe walked away from the crowd of teens. The weight of the general's words lingered in the air, like a fog that refused to lift. Chloe glanced up at her grandfather, his face unchanged, calm as ever. His steps were slow, measured, but there was something different about him today. She could see it in the way he held himself, as if the burden he had carried for so long had finally been acknowledged. "Grandpa, are you okay?" Chloe asked, her voice soft, unsure of how to feel. Grandpa Jack looked down at her, his blue eyes steady. "I've been okay for a long time," he said simply, his voice carrying the calm of someone who had learned to endure. "It's not about being okay. It's about doing what you're supposed to do, and doing it without needing anyone to notice." Chloe wanted to say something more, but the words felt inadequate. How could she express what she was feeling? Pride, relief, confusion, it was all mixed together in her chest. They reached the car, and Grandpa Jack carefully opened the door, his movements deliberate. "You know," Chloe began again, her voice still shaky. "I never really understood what you went through. Not until today. Not until the general." Grandpa Jack nodded, his expression softening. "It's not something I've ever needed to talk about. But people who were there, they know. They understand." Chloe looked out the window, the streets moving past them, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She had always known her grandfather was special, but today, It felt like the entire world had been given a glimpse into his past. And now, the people who had mocked him, they would never forget. The rest of the ride passed in a comfortable silence. When they reached home, Chloe helped her grandfather out of the car, her hands steady, guiding him carefully. He didn't need much help, but she still insisted. Inside the house, Grandpa Jack took a seat at the kitchen table, as he always did. Chloe made them both a cup of tea, the scent of it filling the air. It was peaceful here, away from the noise of the world. As they sat together, sipping their tea, Chloe felt a new understanding settling inside her. Her grandfather wasn't just a quiet old man. He was a symbol of something much greater, of resilience, of sacrifice, and of the quiet dignity that came with a lifetime of service. She looked at him again, this time with a deeper respect. "Grandpa," she said softly, "you don't have to prove anything to anyone. I know who you are." He smiled at her, the corners of his eyes crinkling slightly. "You know, kid," he said, "you're the only one who ever really needed to know." Chloe nodded, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. Today had been a turning point, not just for her grandfather, but for her too. She realized that the most important thing wasn't the medals or the recognition, but the integrity with which someone lived their life. Grandpa Jack had lived his with honor, and that was all that mattered. As the afternoon faded into evening, Chloe felt a quiet pride. She no longer needed to prove her grandfather's worth to anyone. The general had done that for her. Grandpa Jack had always been a hero, and now, everyone would know it. The days that followed seemed to stretch on, with the park incident still fresh in Chloe's mind. Grandpa Jack, ever the stoic, resumed his daily routine with a quiet dignity that left Chloe feeling both proud and protective. It was strange, though. Before that moment, she had always known her grandfather was someone important, but now she felt the weight of his past like never before. She watched him with new eyes, seeing the old man not just as family, but as a living legend. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Chloe finally broke the silence that had settled between them. "Grandpa," she began, her voice soft, "what was it like, really? Back then, I mean, in the seals." Grandpa Jack's gaze lingered on the horizon for a moment, as though he were searching for something far off, a memory buried in time. He didn't immediately respond, but Chloe knew better than to push. Grandpa Jack had never been one to talk about his past. He didn't need to. It was there, in the way he carried himself, in the quiet strength that defined him. After a long pause, Grandpa Jack spoke, his voice low, almost distant. "It wasn't glamorous, Chloe. It wasn't about the medals or the accolades. It was about doing what needed to be done, no matter the cost." Chloe nodded, watching him carefully. She could tell that, even now, some of those memories were too painful to revisit. "I didn't join to be a hero," he continued, his voice steady. "I joined because there were things I needed to do, things that needed doing, and I was the only one who could do them." Chloe's heart ached for him. She had never asked about his service before, never fully understood the depth of what he had been through. But now, as she sat beside him, she felt a need to know, to understand what had shaped him into the man he was. "Was it hard?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Grandpa Jack looked at her, his eyes softening. "Every day? But you do it because you have to. And you do it for the ones beside you, your team, your brothers." There was a pause as Grandpa Jack's gaze returned to the fading light. "Some of them never came back. And that's something you carry with you." Chloe felt the weight of his words settle in her chest. She had always known he had lost friends, but to hear him speak of it so openly was something else. She could see the way the memories haunted him, even now, after all these years. "I didn't want anyone to know, Chloe. It wasn't about being a hero, it was about getting the job done. It was about saving lives." Chloe reached out, placing her hand over his. "But you are a hero, Grandpa. To me, you always have been." He turned to her, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "And to you, I suppose I am. But that's because you're my granddaughter." The night stretched on, and as Chloe sat beside her grandfather, she realized something. It wasn't the recognition from others that mattered to him. It was the quiet, unspoken respect between those who had truly understood, the ones who had shared the hardships, the ones who had been there. As the stars began to twinkle overhead, Chloe felt a deep sense of gratitude. Her grandfather had lived a life of honor, not for the glory, but for the love of his country and the men he had served with. And now, she understood that his greatest legacy was not the past he had left behind, but the quiet strength he had passed on to her. The next few days passed in a quiet, almost surreal calm. Chloe found herself reflecting more than usual, replaying the events in her mind. It wasn't just the way the general had saluted Grandpa Jack. It was the way the world had shifted in that moment. The way the teens, who had once mocked him, now looked at him with a kind of awe, as if they had seen a ghost rise from the past. Grandpa Jack, however, was unchanged. He went about his days with the same steady rhythm. Mornings were spent in silence, sipping coffee and reading the newspaper, afternoons working in the garden, and evenings, as always, on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. But Chloe noticed the small things, the way he carried himself now, a little taller, a little more assured. She had never seen him this way before. It was as if the recognition, the validation he had so long ignored, had finally found him. But there was something more to it. Chloe could feel it in the way he spoke, in the subtle pride that now laced his words, a pride that hadn't been there before. It wasn't about the attention. It was about the acknowledgment. "Grandpa," Chloe said one evening, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "Do you ever think about what the general said?" Grandpa Jack looked up from his chair, his hands resting on his lap, the faintest of smiles tugging at the corners of his lips. "I don't think about it much," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that only time could bring. "But I'm not angry at the world for not knowing. I did what I did because it was right. Not because I wanted people to know. But there's something about being recognized, being seen for the truth of it. It feels different." Chloe nodded, understanding more than she had in the past. Her grandfather wasn't the type to ask for praise, and yet, he had lived his entire life carrying the weight of service, sacrifice, and stories that were never told. "You deserve to be seen, Grandpa," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet admiration. "I know, kid," he replied, his voice steady. "But it's not about that. It's about knowing you did what you were meant to do, regardless of whether anyone else sees it. I've never needed the world to know, but knowing that there's someone who does, that's what keeps me going." Chloe sat there, processing his words, feeling the truth of them settle deep in her chest. The world may never fully understand what Grandpa Jack had done, but she did. And for her, that was enough. A few days later, as they sat together on the porch, Grandpa Jack leaned back in his chair and let out a contented sigh. "You know, kid," he began, "the hardest part of all of this isn't the battles. It's the waiting. The waiting for something that never comes. The waiting for recognition, for respect. It's a long road, and sometimes it feels like you're walking it alone." Chloe looked at him, her heart full. "But you're not alone anymore, Grandpa. You never have been." He turned to her, his expression softening. "No, kid," he said, "I suppose I'm not." And for the first time, Chloe saw her grandfather not just as the man who had been through so much, but as the man who had endured it all with grace, with dignity, and with love. She had always admired him, but now, with the truth of his past laid bare, her admiration grew tenfold. It was a new kind of respect, one that came not just from knowing his story, but from understanding the man who had lived it. And in that moment, sitting side by side with him, Chloe knew that the world didn't need to know Grandpa Jack's story. She did, and that was enough. The weeks that followed were peaceful, almost too quiet for Chloe's liking. Grandpa Jack had returned to his usual routines, but there was a subtle change in him, something lighter in the way he carried himself. He was still the same man, with the same quiet strength, but now, there was a sense of contentment that hadn't been there before. Chloe found herself spending more time with him, asking him questions she had never thought to ask before, wanting to know more about the man behind the stories. One afternoon, as the golden light of sunset poured through the windows, Chloe sat across from Grandpa Jack at the kitchen table. She had a notebook in front of her, ready to write down anything he wanted to share. "Grandpa, I've been thinking," she began, her voice steady but with a note of curiosity. "You've never really talked about the hard stuff. You know, the things you saw and went through." Grandpa Jack looked at her over his cup of coffee, his eyes soft but knowing. "There's nothing to say, kid. I did what I had to do. I don't need to relive it. It's not about the hard stuff. It's about the stuff that comes after." Chloe tilted her head, confused. "What do you mean?" He set his cup down gently, folding his hands in front of him. The hardest part isn't the battle. It's the waiting. The waiting for something to change, for the world to see what you've done. But you can't always count on that. The truth is, you don't do it for anyone else. You do it for the ones you care about. 4. The ones who will carry on. Chloe's mind raced as she processed his words. It made sense now, more than it ever had before. Grandpa Jack wasn't searching for recognition. He never had been. He had lived a life of quiet dedication, always putting others before himself, and that was where his true strength lay. You didn't need anyone to see it, did you? Chloe said softly, a hint of realization in her voice. Grandpa Jack smiled faintly, his eyes distant as he spoke. No, kid. I didn't need anyone to see it. I did what I did because it was right. And when you've done the right thing, there's no need for applause. Chloe felt her heart swell with pride for him. He had always been humble, but she had never fully understood why until now. He wasn't just humble, he was wise beyond measure. I get it now, she said, her voice full of admiration. You did it because it was the right thing to do, and you never needed anyone to notice. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant hills outside the window. That's right, kid. That's all it ever was. Chloe sat back in her chair, feeling the weight of his words settle inside her. She had always admired her grandfather, but now, she felt a deeper understanding. She had seen the recognition from the general, the respect from the soldiers, but she knew that what mattered most to Grandpa Jack wasn't that moment. What mattered was the quiet strength he carried every day, the sacrifices he had made, and the integrity that defined his life. As the evening settled into twilight, Chloe felt a deep sense of gratitude. She was proud of her grandfather, not just for what he had done, but for the way he had lived. And she realized that she too would carry that legacy with her, the legacy of doing what was right, no matter who saw it. Grandpa Jack may not have needed the world to recognize his sacrifices, but Chloe knew that his legacy would live on, in the quiet moments, in the small acts of kindness, and in the heart of the granddaughter who had learned to truly understand him. The weeks passed, and the quiet routine of Grandpa Jack's life seemed to settle back into place. But Chloe noticed that things weren't quite the same anymore, not in the way he moved or in the way he spoke. There was a shift, a subtle change that Chloe couldn't quite put into words. Grandpa Jack had always been a man of few words, his life defined by actions more than anything else. But now, there was a quiet contentment in his demeanor, a peace that hadn't been there before. Chloe found herself watching him more, seeing the layers of his character that she had never fully understood until recently. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch, watching the world drift by, Chloe asked, Grandpa, what's it like knowing that people finally see who you really are? Grandpa Jack took a deep breath, his eyes tracing the horizon. He was silent for a moment, and Chloe didn't press him for an answer. She had learned over the years that Grandpa Jack didn't share much unless he was ready. Finally, he spoke, his voice soft but steady. It's strange, kid, he said. I've never needed anyone to see me for who I really am. But when it happens, it feels like the weight of all those years gets a little easier to carry. Chloe nodded, understanding more than she had before. She had always thought recognition was something her grandfather had wanted, something he deserved. But now she realized that for him, it wasn't about the recognition itself. It was about knowing that the people who mattered, the ones who truly understood, saw him for who he really was. But it's not just the recognition that's important, is it? Chloe asked, her voice thoughtful. Grandpa Jack turned to her, his eyes meeting hers. No, he said quietly. It's the way you live your life. The way you treat people. That's what really matters. Chloe felt the truth of his words settle deep in her chest. She had spent so much of her life trying to understand what made Grandpa Jack tick, trying to figure out the source of his quiet strength. And now, with just a few simple words, she understood. He wasn't driven by the need for recognition or applause. He was driven by a deeper sense of purpose, by the belief that doing what was right, no matter who saw it, was the true measure of a life well lived. The conversation drifted into silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence that was filled with understanding, with the unspoken bond between a granddaughter and her grandfather. They didn't need to say anything more. They had shared enough. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Chloe felt a quiet peace settle over her. She had always admired her grandfather, but now, she felt something deeper, something that came not just from knowing his story, but from understanding the man who had lived it. Grandpa Jack had lived a life of purpose, of honor, and of quiet sacrifice. And Chloe knew that, in some way, he had passed that legacy on to her. It wasn't about the recognition or the accolades. It was about living with integrity, with humility, and with a sense of duty to those who mattered most. As the night fell, Chloe sat beside her grandfather, feeling the weight of the lessons he had taught her. And for the first time, she understood that the true measure of a person wasn't in the stories others told about them. It was in the way they lived, in the choices they made, and in the quiet strength they carried with them every day. The days turned into weeks, and the calm that had settled over Grandpa Jack's life seemed to grow more comfortable, more natural. Chloe watched him, noticing the small changes in him, the quiet contentment in his eyes, the way his movements seemed less burdened by the weight of the past. He had always been a man of few words, but now there was a sense of peace about him that made everything feel in place. One afternoon, as they sat together in the living room, Chloe felt the familiar pull to ask him more. She had learned so much already, but there was still so much left to understand. "Grandpa," she started, her voice soft. "What did it feel like when you first joined the SEALs? Was it something you always knew you wanted to do?" Grandpa Jack looked up from his chair, his gaze steady, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a memory, maybe, or a thought long buried. He set his cup down and looked out the window for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "I never really thought about it the way you might think," he said slowly, his voice low. "I didn't join because I wanted to be a hero. I joined because I wanted to be part of something bigger than myself. The SEALs were they were the best, and I wanted to be the best I could be." Chloe nodded, trying to wrap her mind around it. She had always assumed that people joined for different reasons, sometimes for glory, sometimes for duty. But Grandpa Jack's words felt different. It wasn't about the glory or recognition. It was about doing what needed to be done. "Did you ever regret it?" Chloe asked, her voice barely a whisper. Grandpa Jack shook his head, the faintest of smiles appearing on his face. "Regret? No. There were hard times, sure. There were moments when I thought about walking away. But then I'd remember the guys I was with, the men I was fighting for. And that was enough. When you know you're doing something for the right reasons, there's no room for regret." Chloe felt a lump rise in her throat as she listened to him. His words weren't just the words of a soldier. They were the words of someone who had lived through it all and come out the other side with a kind of quiet wisdom. It wasn't about the battles or the sacrifices. It was about the brotherhood, the sense of duty, and the understanding that what mattered most was the commitment to the mission and to each other. "I never needed anyone to see me as a hero," Grandpa Jack continued, his voice growing softer. "I did it because it was what I was meant to do. And when you do what you're meant to do, you don't need the world to recognize it. The people who matter, the ones who really matter, they see it. That's enough." Chloe sat back in her chair, feeling the weight of his words. For the first time, she realized that it wasn't about the stories or the medals or the recognition. It was about the quiet, unspoken truth of a life well lived. Grandpa Jack had lived a life of purpose, not for applause, but for the men beside him and for the love of what was right. "You've taught me more than anyone ever could, Grandpa," Chloe said, her voice filled with gratitude. "You've taught me what it really means to live with integrity, to live with purpose." Grandpa Jack smiled, the lines on his face softening. "I didn't teach you anything, kid. You've known all along. You just needed to see it for yourself." The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the room as Chloe sat beside her grandfather, her heart full. In that quiet moment, she understood something she had never fully grasped before. It wasn't the grand gestures that defined a person. It was the quiet strength, the ability to live with honor and purpose, day after day. And as she looked at her grandfather, she knew that his legacy, his true legacy, wasn't in the stories he told or the medals he earned. It was in the lessons he had passed on to her, the quiet wisdom that had shaped her life and would continue to guide her in the years to come. As the days went by, the quiet life that Grandpa Jack had built seemed to settle into a rhythm that Chloe had come to appreciate. It wasn't the grand moments that defined their time together, but the small, fleeting ones, the quiet mornings over coffee, the evenings spent watching the sun dip below the horizon, the soft conversations that didn't require many words. Chloe had always admired her grandfather, but now, In this new chapter of their lives, she felt a deeper connection to him than ever before. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Grandpa Jack turned to her with a slight smile, his eyes reflecting the fading light of the day. "You know, kid," he began, his voice calm. "I don't know if I ever told you this, but when I first joined the SEALs, I didn't really know what I was getting into. I thought I did, but the reality of it all, it hits you differently when you're in it. It's not like the movies or the stories. It's harder, but that's what makes it worth it." Chloe listened intently, sensing that this was the first time he was really opening up about his past in a way that felt raw and real. "What did you learn from it?" Chloe asked, her curiosity getting the best of her. Grandpa Jack's smile faded slightly as he took a deep breath, clearly reflecting on something far back in time. "I learned that it's not about the glory. It's not about being a hero. It's about doing what's right, no matter what. It's about being there for the ones you care about, the ones who rely on you. You never know what's going to happen, but you always give everything you have. And that's what gets you through." Chloe could see the weight of his words in his eyes. He wasn't just talking about his time in the SEALs. He was talking about life. "I've always thought you were a hero," Chloe said quietly. "I still do." Grandpa Jack chuckled softly, a warm, almost comforting sound. "I'm no hero, kid. Heroes are the ones who don't come back. The ones who gave everything. The ones who made the ultimate sacrifice. I just did what I had to do." Chloe sat in silence for a moment, absorbing what he had said. She had always viewed her grandfather as something larger than life, but now she understood. He wasn't chasing fame or recognition. He was just living his life the best way he knew how, putting others before himself. "What about now?" Chloe asked, her voice thoughtful. "Now that things have changed, with the general and everything." Grandpa Jack looked out over the yard, his eyes softening. "Now, it's different," he said slowly. "I've had my time, Chloe. I've seen the world in ways most people can't even imagine. And at the end of it all, what matters isn't the battles or the medals. What matters is the life you live when it's all said and done. The people you love, the legacy you leave behind. That's what matters." Chloe felt a deep sense of respect for her grandfather. He had always been a man of integrity, but now she understood the depth of his quiet strength. It wasn't just about surviving the war. It was about living the rest of his life with the same principles that had guided him through the toughest times. "I'm proud of you, Grandpa," Chloe said, her voice filled with admiration. Grandpa Jack looked at her, a soft smile tugging at his lips. "You don't have to be proud of me, kid. Just do the right thing. That's all anyone can ask for." As the evening stretched on, Chloe sat beside her grandfather, feeling the weight of his wisdom settle in her heart. She had always admired him, but now she understood him in a way she never had before. His life was a testament to quiet honor, to doing what was right even when no one was watching. And as she sat there with him, Chloe realized that the lessons he had passed down weren't just about military service or sacrifice. They were about living a life of integrity, no matter the challenges, no matter the recognition. Grandpa Jack had taught her that, and she would carry that lesson with her for the rest of her life. Months passed, and with each day, Chloe found herself more in tune with the quiet strength her grandfather had always carried. It wasn't just the conversations they had shared or the lessons he had passed down. It was the way his life had unfolded, with honor, with humility, and without any expectation for others to notice. The world had seen him as a hero only after years of silence, and yet, he had always been that hero, even before anyone knew his name. One morning, as Chloe prepared breakfast in the kitchen, she noticed Grandpa Jack standing by the window, gazing out at the backyard. She walked over, setting down the spatula, and stood next to him, following his gaze. It was a quiet morning, the kind of morning that felt timeless, where the world seemed to slow down just for a while. "What's on your mind, Grandpa?" she asked gently, not wanting to disturb the peacefulness of the moment. He turned to her, his face softening as he took in the sight of her standing beside him. "I've been thinking, Chloe," he began, his voice steady but filled with thought, "about all the time that's passed, about the things I've done and the things I haven't. You know, the hardest part of all of this isn't the big things, the battles, or the moments of recognition. It's the small things, the things no one else sees. It's the quiet moments when you know you've done something right, and no one else is there to see it." Chloe nodded, understanding what he meant. It wasn't the grand acts that defined a life. It was the quiet acts of integrity, the choices made when no one was watching. She had seen that in him, in the way he carried himself every day, in the way he treated others, in the way he loved her. I get it, Chloe said, her voice soft. You've always done the right thing, Grandpa, even when no one was watching. He smiled at her, a faint but genuine smile, and for the first time, she saw the weight of his past lift slightly from his shoulders. You know, Chloe, he said, his voice filled with a quiet wisdom. That's what matters most. Not the recognition, not the medals. It's about living a life that's true to who you are, regardless of what anyone else thinks. That's where the real strength is. Chloe felt a deep sense of gratitude for the lessons he had given her. It wasn't just about the past. It was about how that past shaped the present and the future. Grandpa Jack wasn't just a hero because of what he had done during his time in the SEALs. He was a hero because of the way he had lived his life, because of the integrity and honor that defined him every single day. I'm proud of you, Grandpa, Chloe said, her voice full of admiration. I always have been, but now I really understand why. Grandpa Jack looked at her, his expression soft and proud. You don't need to be proud of me, kid, he replied. Just live your life with honor, and that'll be enough. That's all anyone can ask for. As the day wore on and they spent time together, Chloe realized something important. Her grandfather had always been her hero, not because of the recognition, but because of the way he had lived his life. His actions, his choices, the quiet strength he carried with him every day, that was what made him a hero. And as she sat with him, she made a silent promise to carry on his legacy, not just in words, but in the way she lived her own life. With honor, with integrity, with quiet strength. It had been a few months since the conversation with Grandpa Jack that had changed Chloe's perspective on life. She had come to realize that her grandfather's true strength wasn't just in his past, but in the quiet way he lived each day. His legacy wasn't in the recognition he received, but in the way he had always lived with honor and integrity, regardless of whether anyone was watching. One evening, as the sun began to set, Chloe sat beside Grandpa Jack on the porch. The air was cool, and the world around them seemed to pause, as it often did at this time of day. Grandpa Jack was looking out at the horizon, his face relaxed but thoughtful. Grandpa, Chloe began, her voice quiet. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if things had been different? Grandpa Jack turned his head slightly to look at her, his expression soft but knowing. Different how, he asked. Chloe hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Well, if things had been easier, or if you had gotten the recognition sooner. Do you ever think about that? Grandpa Jack took a deep breath, the kind of breath that seemed to carry years of experience with it. He gazed out over the yard again, watching the trees sway gently in the breeze. I've thought about it, sure. But the truth is, Chloe, it doesn't matter. What matters is what you do with the time you're given. It's not about the recognition you get in the moment. It's about the legacy you leave behind. It's about how you live when the spotlight's not on you. Chloe thought about his words, letting them settle in her mind. But, Grandpa, you deserve the recognition. You've done so much, and people should know about it, she said, her voice filled with earnestness. Grandpa Jack smiled faintly, a quiet understanding in his eyes. I don't need anyone else's approval, Chloe. I don't need the world to see what I've done. I did what I did because it was the right thing to do. The ones who mattered, the ones who understood, they saw it. And that's enough for me. Chloe nodded, her heart swelling with pride. She had always admired her grandfather, but now, she felt something deeper, something that came from understanding not just the man he was, but the life he had led. I understand now, Grandpa, Chloe said, her voice thick with emotion. It's not about the praise or the recognition. It's about living with purpose. Grandpa Jack's eyes softened as he looked at her. Exactly, he said quietly. It's about living with integrity and doing the right thing, even when no one's watching. That's what makes a life worth living. As the evening wore on, Chloe sat beside her grandfather, feeling the weight of his words and the quiet strength that radiated from him. She had always admired him, but now, she felt a deeper connection, a connection that wasn't just based on admiration, but on understanding. Grandpa Jack had lived a life filled with challenges, sacrifice, and quiet acts of courage. But it wasn't the struggles or the recognition that defined him. It was the way he carried himself, the way he lived each day with honor and respect for others. And now, Chloe knew that the most important lesson he had taught her wasn't about what others saw. It was about what she chose to do with her own life. Grandpa Jack had given her the gift of understanding what it truly meant to live with purpose, and she would carry that gift with her for the rest of her life. It had been another quiet week. The days were slow, but comfortable. Chloe and Grandpa Jack had settled into a rhythm, one that no longer felt heavy with unsaid things. There was a peaceful understanding between them now, something deeper than before. Grandpa Jack still had his quiet, stoic demeanor, but Chloe could see the small changes, the subtle softness in his eyes, the way he seemed to take more joy in the little things, like the way the morning sunlight warmed the porch or the sound of the wind rustling the leaves. One afternoon, after a long day of running errands, Chloe returned home to find her grandfather sitting in his favorite chair by the window. He was staring out at the yard, but this time, he wasn't lost in thought or wrapped in memories. He looked content, at peace. Chloe stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him. She had learned so much from him over the past few months, and now, she realized there was still so much more to understand. She stepped inside quietly, careful not to disturb him. "Hey, Grandpa," she said softly, not wanting to interrupt his thoughts, but feeling the need to talk. "What are you thinking about?" He turned his head slowly, his eyes meeting hers. There was a hint of a smile on his lips. "Just thinking about the little things," he replied, his voice low, filled with an unspoken wisdom. "The things that don't get noticed. The things that make life worth living." Chloe walked over and sat down next to him. "What do you mean?" she asked, genuinely curious. Grandpa Jack took a deep breath, looking out at the yard again, his gaze far away. "You know, Chloe, most people spend their lives chasing after something, recognition, wealth, status. But when you strip all of that away, what's left? It's the quiet moments, the ones you don't think about. It's the way the sun hits the grass, the sound of birds in the morning, the feel of a cool breeze on a hot day. That's where the real beauty is. And that's what matters most." Chloe listened intently, trying to understand the depth of what he was saying. "So, you're saying it's not about the big things, the attention, or the applause?" she asked. Grandpa Jack shook his head, his smile deepening. "No, kid. It's never been about that. It's about the way you live your life when no one's watching. It's about being present in the moment, appreciating the small things that others overlook. Because, in the end, that's what makes a life meaningful." Chloe felt a warmth in her chest as she processed his words. It was as if a light bulb had gone off in her mind. She had always been taught that success and recognition were the markers of a life well lived, but Grandpa Jack was showing her something different. He was showing her that it wasn't the awards or the titles that mattered. It was the quiet moments, the way you treated others, and the integrity with which you lived your life. "I get it now, Grandpa," she said, her voice filled with understanding. "It's about living with purpose without needing anyone to notice. It's about appreciating the beauty in the little things." Grandpa Jack looked at her, his eyes soft and proud. "Exactly, kid. That's the secret to a good life. And I hope you carry that with you, always." Chloe nodded, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the wisdom he had passed down to her. She didn't need recognition or validation from the world. She had everything she needed right here, in the quiet moments shared with the man who had shaped her life in more ways than she could count. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Chloe sat beside her grandfather, the two of them lost in the peaceful silence. She realized that, in this moment, she had everything she needed. And that was enough. It was a bright, quiet morning when Chloe found herself sitting at the kitchen table with Grandpa Jack, the scent of fresh coffee filling the room. The warmth from the sun streaming through the window seemed to match the peace she felt in her heart. Over the past few months, life had slowed down in a way that felt almost comforting. She had learned so much from him, more than she ever expected. Grandpa Jack, despite his age and the years of experience that had shaped him, had this quiet way about him, a calm strength that came from knowing exactly who he was. Chloe had always admired him, but now, sitting across from him, she realized how much she had come to depend on his wisdom, his steady presence. "Grandpa," she began, her voice breaking the comfortable silence. "I've been thinking a lot about everything you've taught me. About living with purpose, about not needing the world's recognition." Grandpa Jack looked up at her, a soft smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He had always been a man of few words, but when he spoke, it carried weight. "You've learned a lot, kid," he said, his voice steady and warm. "And the most important thing is that you've figured out that life isn't about chasing after something others think is important. It's about living the life you believe in, the life that feels right to you. That's what makes all the difference." Chloe nodded, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the lessons he had given her. "I used to think success meant having all these big things, money, recognition, awards. But now I know that the real success is in how you live every day, no matter how small it seems." Grandpa Jack leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful. "That's the key, kid. A lot of people chase after things that look good on the outside. But what matters is how you feel when you look at yourself in the mirror at the end of the day. Are you proud of what you've done? Are you proud of who you are? That's what counts." Chloe let his words sink in, the truth of them resonating deeply. She had always been so focused on achieving what she thought the world wanted from her. But now she realized the importance of simply living authentically. "You know, Grandpa," Chloe said, a smile tugging at her lips, "you've always been my hero. But now I see why. It's not because of the things you've done or the medals you've earned. It's because of the way you live, the way you've always treated people, the quiet strength you carry with you." Grandpa Jack smiled, a faint but genuine smile. "I never did it for the medals, Chloe. I did it because it was the right thing to do. And I'm proud that you understand that now." Chloe felt a swell of emotion in her chest. She had always known her grandfather was special, but now she truly understood why. It wasn't the stories that made him a hero. It was the way he lived his life with honor, with integrity, and with a deep sense of duty to those around him. "I'm proud of you, Grandpa," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "I always have been." He reached across the table, resting his hand on hers, his grip firm but gentle. "And I'm proud of you too, kid. You've got a good head on your shoulders. Just remember, it's the quiet moments, the ones no one else sees, that matter the most." Chloe smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. She had learned so much from him, about life, about love, and about what it really meant to be a hero. It wasn't about grand gestures or public recognition. It was about living each day with purpose, doing what's right, and being true to oneself. And as she sat there with Grandpa Jack, she realized that his lessons weren't just about military service or duty. They were about how to live a life worth living, one filled with honor, humility, and quiet strength. Chloe squeezed his hand, silently promising herself to carry on his legacy, to live her life in the same way he had, with integrity, with love, and with the quiet strength that comes from knowing who you are and doing what's right, no matter who is watching.